primary lessons for me in the whole gathering period that began last April really had to do, initially, it was a whole drama about questions that I would ask him. Right. Because he would come to gatherings every time and look for our questions. He was asking for our real questions about practice and about the teaching, particularly because he was working at the time on reworking significant parts of the Dornhorst Testament. So I was part of the editorial department. I also kind of had that kind of mind. I've always been into the teaching, and so I was, it became fairly frequent that I would, be the one who would initiate a question that he would then talk about. And what became obvious after a period of time, although he had to point it out, was that I brought to the whole matter of questions a matter of looking at the teaching and finding things in it that I didn't understand, or I thought I didn't understand, or that even if I thought I knew the answer, I thought would be good questions to ask. Something that I felt like might not be clear to everyone, or that I thought was maybe an interesting kind of contradiction in the teaching or something that I thought that he could then expound on. So I would ask questions that were basically, when it came down to it, were just clever questions that had to do with a very verbal level of the teaching consideration.
But you were into that, right?
Yeah, that was totally what my whole thing was. And I thought it was great. It's kind of an opportunity. Like, in a way, it goes way back for me, because one of the first questions I ever asked him was when I first came in 1976, and he would often gather with students and practitioners at the time and answer questions. And I got up and I said, at the end of the knee of listening, you say, "I hold up my hands." What does that mean? Which was, at the time, like, I thought this was a really good question, because there was no devotional culture. We hadn't really fully developed the whole consideration of, like, surrender and self-submission and all of that. It was not developed. So the whole thing of "I hold up my hands," the devotional gesture didn't exist at the time. We simply practiced the way of understanding. So I thought I had a really good question. So at that particular case, this is a clear, wonderful example of, like, the kind of game that basically I was into. He looked at me and he was silent for a minute, and the thing that went through, he basically gave me enough time to, like, hang myself. And I waited, and I waited, and he waited, and the more he waited, I felt, it was like only a space of a few seconds, but in that time, through my mind raced this idea that maybe I'd asked him a question that he couldn't answer, that there was something, like, esoteric about it that he couldn't give away, or that there couldn't be explained or something. So I thought, oh, well, I'll help him out. I'll give him some way that he can bridge the gap. So I said, "This is the only part of your teaching, your paradoxical language, that I haven't understood." He looked at me and he said, "Well, far be it from me to relieve you of this singular grace." Whereupon he picked up his cane and walked out of the room. Everybody cracked up. But it was like a classic thing of my feeling like it was a real gotcha game when it came down to it. I was not aware of it, and it was what became revealed over this period of gatherings was that kind of mind was basically kind of an adolescent conflictual relationship with my teacher as the male other, as, like, my father, basically, who I was trying to convince of something or find some kind of contradiction. And the classic form of the questions I would ask would be, you say this in one place and you say this in another place. They seem to say something a little bit different. I don't understand.
So what did he do with that?
So he, in this particular case, what happened was that there was a point in the Dornhorst Testament where I'd found this kind of basic contradiction. Although I was not yet fully aware of the game that I was playing, that I was assuming there was some kind of contradiction and basically challenging him. And so, in the one evening, I had asked him a question like this, and he had then expounded on it. But at some point, he had, like, also said very clearly, he said, "It seems completely obvious to me. There is no contradiction between these two. This is not a reflection of a failure of my part in the teaching and the creation of the language. It's totally, the logic flows completely. And in fact, it just reflects the fact that you're very sophomoric and that you haven't really studied the argument at all. And you just haven't applied yourself to the study of the teaching." So that was that. It was amusing. He said, "Where's my stick?" He said, "You came to the Roshi with this kind of question, you get beaten, thoroughly thrashed." So the next evening he came in and he put on these reading glasses, half glasses that he wears, and he pushed them way down on his nose, and he looked over and he said, "Will the class please come to order? Get out your lesson books." He said, he said, "This is Professor Pfaffenbickler." And he said, "Well, the class will begin." And he said, and he began to take, attendance and that kind of thing. And basically what he went on to do was to point out the fact that what I was doing, and a few others of us, and then over the years many people had done similar kinds of things, was to bring a kind of academic training, a kind of sophomoric, clever mind to a study of the teaching and to the matter of questions addressed to him, in which, as he said, classically in a university setting or a college setting, you're given two texts. As he said, you're given a group of poems, or a poem by T.S. Eliot and a poem by John Donne, and you're supposed to compare the two. And in the course of presenting your presentation, the professor then challenges you and shows you the inadequacies of your argument, the contradictions in your argument. Or else you in your own paper show the contradictions in an argument. You might say that really Donne represents a much more profound appreciation of death than T.S. Eliot. See? And in that case, see, then you show the inadequacies of the person who is regarded as a person who was of some accomplishment or whatever.
And of course, he went through tremendously rigorous training in that whole.
Exactly, as he said.
Career.
Yeah, yeah. And to Columbia, he said you would be given these kind of conundrums in which it would break your mind, and finally, in the end, you develop some kind of discriminative capacity. But he said it should come to the point where you have respect for the people with whom you're dealing. It's not that you abandon discrimination, but you bring in great respect. So what he said was, we tend to treat, and I was tending to treat, the teaching as something objective, to be tested, and the master to be tested, the teacher to be tested. And in that way, it was a challenge, rather than, as he said, a submission to him as teacher, a consideration of the argument. And he said, to the point of discovering that the teaching argument is an internal voice with which you are fundamentally sympathetic, and that it speaks to you from a point prior to the mind.
So how did this play out?
What it was for me, as he played out the thing, and he would say, he would periodically be talking about this right relation, the difference between the academic approach to the teaching and the approach of one who was a serious student of the teaching, of a sacred teaching. And he would say, "Right, Mr. Spence," and he would point out, and what he would point out was the kind of irony, the kind of sarcasm, the kind of challenging nature that even professors in universities then bring to their students, while challenging them, while they are instructing them in that very same kind of a sophomoric challenging point of view. So that what it was for me was an extended, like, hour and a half, excruciating lesson in the kind of offense, the kind of abuse that I had been involved in these questions that seemed to me to be good questions. They seemed to be something that really needed answering. And what the lesson was in the midst of it was that the question that I was asking was really only a kind of a cipher or a symbol for, or a symptom of something much more deep, which had to do with my conflictual relationship with the teaching and my conflictual relationship to him as a male other and as therefore as my teacher. And it began a process of my having to really inspect the real depth of a degree of adolescence and conflict with others that I hadn't fully inspected before, and see, I had thought that basically, here I was in Hermitage, sitting in front of him after being a practitioner for some 12 years, feeling that I was a serious student at the teaching, when in fact, from lack of real self-observation, the whole Oedipal drama, the whole adolescent drama was still totally in place and being enacted on an abstract level through a kind of academic question that I would pose to him.
The thing that makes it, it's not like you don't ask questions, because he wants people to ask real questions.
Right.
So,
but what happens is that you discover that unless you really inspect your question, he says, the asking of real questions is a sadhana. It's a practice in itself to discover what your real question is. So that, and then invariably what one discovers is that there's one level of question that one asks, but then in consideration with him or in the dialogue with him that develops, if you can allow it, you will discover that in fact he'll point out to you what your real sense of dilemma is that makes you ask the question in the first place. And that
so you take your lumps.
You take your lumps, yeah, and you've got to be prepared to, and alive enough and open enough in that consideration to allow what he's revealing to you to really penetrate, to get the real lesson of what your real question is. He will answer your question on some level, and he will also really address your question, yourself as a question.